As for you, Harold, you're playing?
Well, good luck with your blockbuster.
Thank you.
All right, I will prove to you that there are no monsters in your room.
A boy named Marshall and his friend Gilbert head to a cinema to watch a horror movie about a scary monster named Warthead. Just before the movie ends, Gilbert gets really scared and runs out of the building. Marshall also follows him and wonders why Gilbert can't just wait for the movie to end before they leave. Gilbert still seems terrified of Warthead, and he asks how Marshall can stand watching movies like that. Marshall explains that getting scared is what makes the horror movies fun.
Why are you so obsessed with that purple-eyed panda anyway?
But Gilbert mentions that they aren't fun for him. As they head home, Marshall asks how Gilbert will enjoy the upcoming Halloween if he's always scared of everything. Gilbert says he doesn't have to be scared to enjoy it, and that he even likes going to their school's Halloween carnival. Marshall complains that Gilbert doesn't go to the haunted houses at the carnival, and that for the last one, he spent most of the night playing a ring toss game. Gilbert says he only did that because he wanted to win a purple-eyed panda, which he has always been obsessed with since he was little. Marshall eventually says that he wants to go to a nearby store.
Yes! No. I saw your eyes blink.
To get some slime for his Warthead Halloween costume. When they get there, the store owner, Buzzy, tries to scare them with her costume. Gilbert instantly falls for it, but Marshall says he wasn't scared because he saw Buzzy's eyes moving. Buzzy says she's still working on her act for the carnival's haunted house, and that she hopes everyone reacts the same way Gilbert did. Marshall then asks for the slime he needs, and as Buzzy gets it for him, she asks if he has seen the latest Warthead movie. Before she starts talking about it, Marshall tells her not to give him spoilers because he still hasn't watched how the movie ended.
Yeah, big world people.
Buzzy looks shocked by this, but Marshall mentions that Gilbert made them leave the cinema before the end. After the boys leave the store, Marshall tells Gilbert that he feels the need to help his friend face his fears. He adds that Gilbert is missing out on a lot of things because of how scared he is. Gilbert asks why he cares so much about it, and Marshall says that the world is awesome, and he wants his friend to experience it all. Gilbert still doesn't think he needs this, but Marshall tells him to start facing his fears by playing a game in which he'll ring the doorbell of a neighbor's house and run away.
Go up, ring the doorbell, then run. Easy peasy.
Marshall then tells Gilbert to do it at the house of their neighbor, Mr. Kubot. Gilbert looks scared and says he can't do that because Kubot is really scary and there are rumors that he's a serial killer. Marshall still tells him to do it, and Gilbert goes toward Kubot's porch. On his way, he sees a beheaded garden gnome on the ground and looks scared, but he still tries to remain calm. Just as he's about to ring the doorbell, Kubot shows up behind him and asks what Gilbert is doing at his house. Gilbert looks really scared and says that he came to invite Kubot to the carnival, but the angry neighbor shouts at him to leave.
Ow! Come on, go, go, go!
Gilbert then runs to meet Marshall, and they quickly find a place to hide because they're both scared of Kubot. After Kubot enters his house, Marshall says that the game didn't really turn out to be bad, but Gilbert says it was worse. He then asks if Marshall would like to come to his house for dinner. Marshall says he can't do that because his mom's annoying boyfriend, Ted, is coming home for dinner. Shortly after, Marshall arrives home and sits at the table with Ted and his mom, Diane. Interestingly, Ted happens to be very nice, and he even tries to engage Marshall in a conversation about Halloween and scary movies. However, Marshall doesn't seem interested, and he heads to his room.
Sometimes kids just need time to adjust.
Diane looks disappointed by this, and she heads to Marshall's room to tell him that she really likes Ted and would love it if Marshall gave him a chance. Marshall says it's too soon, but Diane mentions that she and Marshall's dad have been divorced for 5 years. She adds that it's time for both of them to move on, and she'd like to be with Ted because he makes her happy. She also mentions that being with Ted won't affect the way she loves Marshall, but he still seems to have doubts about his mom's new boyfriend.
I mean, we're doing just fine on our own.
Later that night, Gilbert calls Marshall and tells him to look at Kubot's house. Interestingly, Kubot and some men happen to be moving a big object into his house, and Gilbert says he thinks it's a dead body. Marshall doesn't think so, and he mentions that it's likely just a statue. Gilbert still thinks Kubot is is up to something, but Marshall rules it out as anything serious. The next day, Gilbert and Marshall head to a museum for a school trip. When they get there, their teacher, Ms. Pratt, tells all the students to choose a partner to work with at the museum. A new girl named Amy fails to get a partner, so Pratt tells her to team up with Gilbert and Marshall.
Miss Pratt, there's no one left to buddy with.
As Amy walks up to them, Marshall asks if she's the new girl, and she confirms this. She then mentions that she just moved to town from a place called Rockport. Marshall asks if she likes the new town, but she says she doesn't because it's too boring. Gilbert asks how exciting she expects it to be, and Amy mentions that she aspires to be an investigative journalist, and to do that, she needs to find stories, which the new town doesn't have. Gilbert mentions that she might eventually be surprised, but Amy says she doubts it. Just then, she sees a warthead sticker on Marshall's bag.
You didn't stay for the ending?
Because of me.
And talks about being a fan. Marshall looks happy about this, but just before Amy tries to talk about how the latest movie ended, he tells her not to say anything because he missed it. Amy finds this surprising, but Gilbert says they had to leave early because of him. Almost immediately, a bully named Todd snatches Marshall's pack of chips and refuses to give it back. Amy doesn't look happy about this, and she eventually gets it back for Marshall after lying to Todd about the side effects of eating the chips.
News reports it's a sugar substitute, but it has its...
Shortly after, the students are taken to the Egyptian section of the museum. The docent then shows them a sarcophagus and asks if any of them knows what it is. Interestingly, only Amy happens to know what it is, and the docent explains to the other students that the sarcophagus usually holds a wooden coffin with a mummy inside. Marshall asks if there's a real mummy inside the sarcophagus on display, but the docent says that there isn't one there. She then takes them to see a real mummy, who archaeologists believe was a princess from 2000 BC.
Shouldn't there be another mummy?
As the docent asks if the students have any questions, Amy asks why there are two sarcophagi but only one mummy. The docent commends Amy for being observant, and she mentions that the other mummy was believed to be a high priest. She adds that the high priest and the princess were said to be in love, but their families were bitter rivals. She also mentions that their attendants decided to entomb them together so they could be with each other in death. Amy says it's a nice story, but the docent mentions that the two mummies weren't together for long because their tomb was raided many years ago and they were taken to different museums.
I can't figure her out.
She adds that her museum was just about to reunite them for the first time in years, but the high priest's mummy mysteriously disappeared on the way. Amy asks if it was stolen, and the docent confirms this. She then jokes that if any of them sees a mummy, they can call the museum's mummy hotline. After this, she shows the kids a full-sized reproduction of an Egyptian coffin, and Marshall heads into it with Gilbert to take a picture. When they return to school, they decide to ask if Amy wants to hang out with them.
Like I said, I'm gonna be an investigative reporter, so...
And she immediately accepts their offer. As they leave school together, Marshall asks how she knew about the sarcophagus, and Amy says that as an investigative journalist, she just has to know certain things. Gilbert then jokes that Amy has to investigate Kubot because they saw him moving a dead body into his house the previous night. Amy sounds shocked by this, and as she asks more questions about what they saw, she realizes that they might have found the stolen mummy. She seems excited by this and tells the boys to take her to Kubot's house.
I've gotta be home for dinner.
When they get there, Amy says that the house has a crime scene written all over it, and that they have to come back at night with their flashlights so they can sneak around to look inside through the windows. Gilbert thinks it's a bad idea because Kubot is scary, and Marshall adds that what they saw the previous night might not be the high priest's coffin. Amy still insists that they have to check Kubot's house at night, and she eventually heads home. Later that night, they all meet up at Kubot's house while he's not around.
Amy was right.
Gilbert still has doubts about sneaking around the house, but Amy and Marshall tell him not to be scared. Just as they look inside Kubot's basement, Amy says there has to be something there, and she suggests breaking in to see what they can find. After they enter the basement through the window, Amy tells the boys that they have to look around, but Gilbert refuses to do this because he's still very scared that Kubot might catch them. Following this, Amy and Marshall start looking around, but Gilbert suddenly hears a strange sound as he tries to find where it's coming from.
This thing is heavy.
He sees the high priest's coffin and eventually opens it. The mummy still happens to be intact, but as the body falls on Gilbert, he freaks out and looks terrified. After he leaves to call his friends, the moonlight shines on the mummy's amulet, and this makes it come alive. When Gilbert brings his friends back to the spot where he left the mummy, they realize that it's not there, and they wonder if he's lying. Almost immediately, the mummy appears behind them, and they quickly run to the living room to find a place to hide. Marshall drops his flashlight in the process, and the mummy breaks down the door and a wall to find them. The kids look really scared, but the mummy just points Marshall's flashlight toward him. They then realize that the mummy only followed them to give Marshall his flashlight. Marshall doesn't seem sure about collecting it, but Gilbert tells him to take the flashlight so that the mummy won't get pissed. After Marshall does this, the kids start wondering how the mummy came back to life, and Gilbert wonders if it's because he opened the coffin. Almost immediately, Kubot arrives home with his men, and the kids quickly leave the house through the back. Just as Kubot enters the house, he sees the damaged wall and realizes that someone broke in when he wasn't around. He also heads to the basement and realizes that the mummy is gone. Interestingly, Kubot believes that the mummy was stolen, and he says that he'll make the thief pay for what they did. After the kids look relieved to have escaped from the house, they suddenly see the mummy heading toward them. They look shocked by this, but Amy eventually mentions that they can't let the mummy go back to Kubot's house. As Amy says that one of them has to keep him at home, she and Gilbert tell Marshall to do it.
Not real one.
Marshall initially refuses to do this, but after his friends leave him alone, he eventually takes the mummy to his house. When he gets there, he sneaks the mummy in without allowing Diane and Ted to know what's happening. After they get to his room, the mummy starts moving around to admire the things inside. Almost immediately, Diane comes to Marshall's room to give him a box of pizza. Marshall quickly hides the mummy behind the door before collecting the pizza from his mom. As she's about to leave, she asks Marshall what's smelling badly in his room, but he says that it's his gym socks. Diane then tells him to wash them because they stink, and she eventually leaves the room. Marshall looks relieved by this, and he sprays some perfume on the mummy to reduce his bad smell. After this, he gives the mummy a slice of pizza and puts some hot sauce on it. The mummy happens to like the hot sauce, and Marshall mentions that the only person he knew who liked it so much was his late grandfather, whose name was Harold. Marshall then gets an idea and decides to name the mummy Harold.
This should be more comfortable than that old coffin.
After this, Marshall gives Harold a mat to sleep on for the night. The next morning, Marshall gets ready for school and tells Harold to stay inside his room till he returns home. After he leaves, he meets up with his friends and tells them that the mummy is actually cool. He adds that he named the mummy Harold, and his friends seem okay with it. Gilbert then asks if Marshall has seen his inhaler because it has been missing since the previous day. Marshall says he hasn't, and Gilbert mentions that he has to find it because his mom would be pissed. After they get to school, Pratt informs the kids that they have to work on a project together. Marshall asks if they can make a movie, and Pratt says it's a brilliant idea. Gilbert seems confused by this, but Marshall tells him and Amy that they're going to make a mummy movie with a real mummy. Elsewhere, Harold leaves Marshall's room and eventually heads out of the house to start walking around aimlessly. Most people think he's just wearing a nice Halloween costume, so they ignore him. Suddenly, Harold sees a bus with a poster of the Egyptian princess on it. As he gets close to the poster, he looks sad that he's not with the princess. The bus then starts moving, and one of Harold's wraps gets stuck to it. He's eventually dragged on the road until he gets free just in front of the museum. As he sees the princess poster on the wall, he decides to go inside the museum to find her. Elsewhere, Marshall and his friends quickly leave school after the bell rings. When they get to Marshall's house, they see that the door is open, and they realize that Harold is not inside anymore. As they look worried, they immediately decide to check around the town to see if they'll find him. Before they leave, Kubot stops them and asks if they saw anyone at his house the previous night because someone broke in. The kids look quite nervous, but they manage to convince Kubot that they didn't see anything. After walking around the town for a while, they find Harold inside the museum, looking at the princess inside her coffin. Marshall and the others realize that Harold came to see her, but they tell him they need to leave before anyone sees them.
Harold!
Harold keeps pointing at the princess's amulet, but the kids don't understand this. After they leave the museum, Amy says that they need some expert advice on what to do with Harold, and Marshall suggests going to see Buzzy. When they get to her store, Buzzy looks shocked and excited to see that Harold is really alive. She then asks if he's the mummy that was stolen, but Gilbert says they didn't steal it. Marshall adds that they're just trying to keep Harold away from the people who stole him. After Buzzy checks Harold's amulet, she sees an inscription on the back and takes a picture of it so she can try to decode it. Since it will take some time to get that done, the kids leave the store with Harold and decide to start making their movie. Just before they start, Diane and Ted come over to meet them. They both look shocked to see Harold, but Marshall says he's just a kid from their school who is playing the role of a mummy in their movie. Ted then mentions that he brought some items that can be used for the movie. Marshall doesn't seem interested in them, and Ted looks disappointed. After he leaves with Diane, Marshall complains that Ted is annoying.
What's your problem with him exactly?
But Amy thinks he's just being hard on his mom's boyfriend because he doesn't want anyone to be with her. She adds that if Ted makes Diane happy, Marshall has to give him a chance. Shortly after, they shoot their movie and eventually return to Buzzy's store to see what she has found. Buzzy happens to have already decoded the inscription, and she discovers that the amulet can bring back the dead when exposed to moonlight. However, the person will only stay alive for 3 days, after which they'll turn to dust if they don't return to their coffin by midnight on the 3rd day. The kids look shocked by this, and Gilbert realizes that the 3rd day is the next day, which happens to be Halloween. As he says that they have to return Harold to his coffin before midnight on Halloween, Marshall looks sad, but Amy says that they have to do what's best for the mummy, because that's what friends do. Elsewhere, Kubot meets with a woman named Ingrid, who has actually paid him to steal a mummy for her. Kubot says there's a slight delay with the job, but Ingrid tells him to make sure he delivers the mummy as planned, or he'll face the consequences. Later that night, Marshall and the others take Harold to Kubot's house to try to put him back into his coffin.
Coffin!
Looks like
Just then, they see Kubot's men taking the coffin away from the basement and putting it inside a truck with a penguin logo on it. Kubot then tells them to take it to a nearby factory because it will be safe there. As they leave, the kids look disappointed because they don't know where the coffin is being taken, but they still tell Harold that they'll get it back for him. After Kubot enters the basement to turn off the light, he sees Gilbert's inhaler on the floor and realizes that the kids were the ones who broke into his house. The next day, while the kids are thinking about where the coffin might be, Kubot shows up at Gilbert's house with his men. The kids quickly try to run away, but he eventually blocks them. He then says that he only wants the mummy back, and Marshall mentions that it's right behind him. Interestingly, Harold happens to be there, but as Kubot's men try to grab him, he lifts them and throws them to the ground. He then runs away with the kids, and Kubot looks shocked. He says that he has always heard about the possibility of reanimation, but he thought it was a superstition. As one of his men asks if Harold is the mummy they stole, Kubot says it is, and that his price just went up. Meanwhile, the kids bump into Ted on the road, and as he asks what they're up to, Marshall says that they're going to the Halloween carnival. Before they leave, Amy asks Ted if he grew up in the town, and he says he did. She then asks if he knows any company that has a penguin on their truck. Ted says it's the logo of an ice cream company that went out of business years ago. Amy then asks where their factory used to be, and Ted says it's just outside the town. After a while, Kubot heads to Marshall's house and asks Diane if Marshall is at home because she wants to offer him a job. Diane says he's not at home, but Ted arrives and says that he saw Marshall and his friends heading to the carnival. Kubot thanks him for the information and leaves the house immediately.
Yeah, and I don't see asking our parents to give us a ride.
As the kids try to figure out how they'll get to the abandoned factory where Harold's coffin is, Marshall says they can get Buzzy to drive them there. Since Buzzy is at the carnival, they first head to a nearby store to get some costumes. After they get to the carnival, Amy and Marshall decide to find Buzzy, while Gilbert stays with Harold. Interestingly, Harold sees Pratt dressed as an Egyptian princess, and he goes to dance with her. Gilbert tries tries to tell him that Pratt isn't a real princess, but Harold doesn't listen to him. Meanwhile, Kubot and his men arrive at the carnival and start looking for Harold. It doesn't take long before they see Harold, and Gilbert quickly takes him away to find Amy and Marshall, who have already found Buzzy. Kubot then tells his men to distract Harold when they find him. Just as Buzzy is about to lead the kids out to where she parked her car,
You guys really want to do this again?
Kubot's men show up and try to distract Harold. Almost immediately, Kubot takes off Harold's amulet, and he goes unconscious. Kubot looks happy about this, and he tells his men to take Harold to the car because their buyer is waiting. He then tells the kids to make sure they forget everything that has happened that night. After Kubot and his men leave, the kids look disappointed, but Buzzy still offers to take them to the ice cream factory. On the way, Marshall says that they just have to sneak into Kubot's hideout, create a diversion, put Harold back into his coffin, take him back to the museum, and get Kubot arrested. Gilbert thinks it won't be easy to do all that because they're still kids, but Amy mentions that Marshall's plan might work if they're able to create a distraction. Buzzy says she can help with that, and she tells the kids to look at the strobe lights, web guns, sound effect machines, remote control spiders, and the other things she has in her trunk.
Hey, great plan. Except for...
Marshall calls her a genius for this, and she looks quite happy. When they get to the ice cream factory, Gilbert says he can't follow them inside because he's scared. Marshall says that he has to face his fears, but Gilbert doesn't seem ready for this. As he walks away, Marshall looks disappointed and says that they don't need Gilbert anyway. Meanwhile, Ingrid is already at the factory, and as Kubot shows her the living mummy and tells her that he wants to renegotiate the price for the deal, she agrees to do just this. He then hangs the amulet on a statue and heads to his office to talk to Ingrid. Elsewhere, Gilbert thinks about what Marshall said about facing his fears, and he decides to do this. Back inside the factory, Amy and Buzzy distract the guards so that Marshall can get the amulet. Just before he grabs it, Kubot sees him, and the guards also bring Amy and Buzzy to the room. Ingrid asks what's going on, but Kubot says they're just kids.
It's written on the amulet.
He seems pissed that they came to disrupt his deal, but he seems more concerned about wrapping it up with Ingrid. Marshall then begs Kubot to put Harold back into the coffin before he turns into dust. Kubot thinks he's just making things up, but Gilbert suddenly shows up inside the factory. Marshall looks happy to see Gilbert, and before Kubot's men grab him, he gets the amulet. He then throws it toward Harold, and it fits quite well around his neck. As Harold wakes up, he breaks his chains and beats up the guards. Before Ingrid and Kubot escape, Marshall stops them with one of the traps he set. The kids then hug Harold before tying up Kubot and the others. As they then look for Harold's coffin, they see that it has been broken and they look disappointed. However, Amy mentions that they should be able to use the empty coffin at the museum. Almost immediately, they head to the museum with only a few minutes left until midnight, and Harold helps them break in.
I'll wait here for the authorities and stop them!
After the kids get him to put down the coffin next to the princess, Harold suddenly drags her toward the direction of the moonlight. With this, her amulet comes alive, and she wakes up. Harold and the princess seem surprised to see each other again, and Marshall and his friends look happy for them. They eventually tell Harold that it's nearly midnight, and he says goodbye to them. Marshall looks sad to see him leave, and he hugs Harold tightly. After this, Harold enters his coffin while the princess gets into hers. Marshall then gives Harold a bottle of hot sauce before the mummies go back to sleep and their coffins get closed. Following this, Marshall and the others run out of the museum before the cops find them there. The next day, Marshall watches a news story about how the museum officials mysteriously found Harold beside the princess. He also watches when it is reported that Kubot, Ingrid, and their guards have been arrested after the police got an anonymous tip.
It's probably Ted. He's coming over for a late breakfast.
Almost immediately, the doorbell rings, and Diane tells Marshall to open the door for Ted. When Marshall sees Ted, he says he's happy to see him. He also mentions that he wants Ted to help him with his next movie about vampires. Ted looks shocked by this, but he says he's ready to help. After Ted walks away to wash his hands, Diane asks why Marshall is suddenly nice to her boyfriend. Marshall then says that people who make each other happy deserve to be together. After this, he heads to school and looks happy to see his friends. Amy then mentions that she's now a reporter for the school's newspaper. Marshall and Gilbert look happy about this, and Amy says that she has decided to stay in the new town. As she then asks what they do for fun in the town, Gilbert suggests going to watch Warhead. Marshall sounds shocked to hear this, but Gilbert says he's no longer scared.
I thought you didn't like scary movies.
After they agree to go and see the movie later, they head to their classroom and look happy together. Despite initially deciding to keep the mummy as his friend, Marshall realized that Harold would turn to dust if he didn't return to his coffin by midnight on Halloween. Amy and Gilbert made him understand that he had to do what was best for Harold, because it's what friends do for each other, even though they were just little kids. Marshall and his friends took down Kubot and ensured that Harold returned to the museum safely. In this story, we learn that real friends always do what's best for each other, even when tough choices are involved.